Amen. It's interesting, as you watch the videos, you just get taken so many different places. And it's a lot of fun. So, today we're going to talk about one of the powerful moments when the word go is employed. It's from Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abraham went, and as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. And at that time the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So Abram built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And from there he moved to the hill country of the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. This is the word of God. Well, go to a place that I will show you. Sounds a little bit insecure if you ask me. But Abraham is the father of faith. He believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. This is one of the key people and one of the key elements of who Abraham is. God said something, and he believed what God said, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He didn't do something to be considered righteous. He believed the word of God spoken to him, and that is what made him right with God. Abraham, he's the guy who was willing to sacrifice his son, which was actually not required, but it was a foreshadow of what God was going to do, sacrificing his son for the salvation of humanity. So we see a belief. Abraham, it says in Hebrews, thought that God would raise his son from the dead. Okay, so he believed what God said. He knew that this was the seed, the promise. And so, I don't understand what you're doing, but I'm going to follow you. I'm going to obey you. I'm going to believe you can do anything. And God said, actually, I'll be the one sacrificing my son, not you. And this incredible journey of faith, it all happened with this moment, the initial step of responding to God's call to go to a land that I will show you. And faith, it's defined in Hebrews 11:1 as the assurance of things hoped for, the certainty of what we do not see. Okay? So you have the assurance of what God said will be coming your way, and you believe in what you don't see yet. Okay, we live by faith, not by sight. And I'm going to say this awkward comment. Faith is an intangible reality. It's real, but you don't see it. It's almost, I remember somebody said to me, "I'll believe it when I see it." And he turned it around and said, "I'll see it when I believe it." There comes a moment when faith precedes your journey. And I love what Hudson Taylor, the father of mission, said. Unless there's an element of risk in our exploits for God, there's no need for faith. If you can do it on your own, if you don't need God, then faith isn't required. But when you want to tackle something big, when you want to step into the impossible, guess who's available, interested, and wants to be released in your life? The living God. And he's inviting us into the world of faith. And you and I, we don't know what lies ahead, but he does. Okay? He sees things that we don't. He knows things that we don't. He has a plan for your life way beyond what you can imagine. And when he calls you, he doesn't really care about your qualification. He just cares about the state of your heart, that you're willing to go and speak to that scary person, or invest financially in that ministry, or be inconvenienced on your schedule so that somebody else might have an encounter with God. He's always looking for someone that lets God interrupt our path. And the life of faith is difficult because we're asked to believe God, and yet the problem is we want to take control of our lives, and so there's a tug of war about who's in charge of our lives. For instance, if God would have said to me, I want you to go to a land that I will show you, I would have said, well, Lord, let's have a conversation about this. Exactly where are we going? Okay, I'm a little bit of a planner. Okay, I'm not a control freak, Lord, but I do like to plan. I'd like to have the map. I need to know where we're going to be staying. And by the way, my wife considers the Comfort Inn camping, so, we might need Yelp to get some reviews on where we can stay. Lord, can't you give me a little bit more? And God's calling Abram. I'm going to call him Abraham throughout this whole story. His name is Abram at this point. But he's calling him away from what's familiar, what's comfortable, the things that are predictable, the normal routine. And there's a comfort in the normal routine. But the problem is the normal routine can get in the way of you experiencing the adventure of life. I found this poem, Opportunities Missed. There was a cautious man who never laughed or played. He never risked, he never tried, he never sang or prayed. And when one day he passed away, his insurance was declined. For since he never really lived, they claimed he never died. And this is the thing about God. He's always doing a new thing, which causes all of us to ask the question, is anything new happening in your life? Is there a new dynamic, a new relationship, a new agenda? Is God up to something in your life? Because there's always a fresh component when you walk with Him. And God called Abram to a place he had not yet seen, to a land that I will show you. And this is stepping out in faith. And I want you to notice something. You step out in faith before you receive the blessing. The stepping out precedes the blessing. And there's a vulnerability to following a God who says, go, and I'll guide you later on. Remember when we had Pastor Bill here, his father, Henry Vanderbush, he was a traveling evangelist. And one day, God told him, go to Florida. So he buys a ticket for he and his wife. They fly to Tampa. His wife says, what now? He says, I don't know. Let's just sit over here. So they sit over there for some time, and then all of a sudden this man comes wandering into the area where they're sitting and says, Henry Vanderbush? God told me that you'd be here. We need you to speak at our church. Now, I don't know about you, and I like to think I'm a man of faith, but I would have just needed a lot more information in the plan. I mean, that's just an incredible way of seeking and following the Lord. And when God tells you to go, and I'll lead you to your next moves, you have to understand that people are going to interrupt and say, hey, listen, you're a friend of mine, and I don't know what you had for dinner last night, but I just don't know that the Lord would call you to do something so hard, to be inconvenienced. It seems expensive to me. Or worse, we'll try to talk ourselves out of following God's promptings, okay? And you have to decide, did the Lord speak to me? Because if He did, I'm going to step out and take a risk. And I want you to hear me. Even if you make a mistake, He's going to go with you. He's going to be impressed. Wow, they were willing to listen to me. You know, I read about John Galbraith. He was worked in politics back in Lyndon Johnson's regime. And he had a housekeeper. And he said to his housekeeper one day, you know, I feel so tired. I'm going to take a nap, and I don't care who calls. I'm not taking any calls. Let me take a nap. Well, the president, Lyndon Johnson, calls. Is John there? Yes, sir. Can I speak to him? No, sir. Why not? Well, he's taking a nap. Well, wake him up. I can't. He told me not to wake him up. I'm the president of the United States. She says, yeah, but I work for him, not for you. John gets up later and calls the president, and he says, man, I want to hire that woman. Okay? And friends, I want you to understand something. You and I, we're accountable to God alone, and we follow His dictates. And sometimes He asks us to do things that don't make sense, things that we don't want to do, things that sound pretty scary. But again, if God's not required, it's really nothing that's important. But when God's required, suddenly faith gets activated and the supernatural activity of God is underway. And I know that He's calling everybody in this room, everybody tuned in, to go to some area in your life. He might want you to go to a neighbor and encourage them. He might want you to share your faith to somebody at work. He might want you to participate in a ministry that you've been holding back from. He might want you to participate financially. And I bring up financially because this is an area that often gets in the way of us going forth. Okay? Yesterday, I read in a secular review that money is the number one religion. Okay? It's the number one. Jesus talked about the man who had a surplus, and instead of sharing what he had, he built bigger barns. Demas, he pursued money in 2 Timothy 2:10 rather than continue to journey with the Apostle Paul. Gehazi, he pursued Naaman. Remember the guy that came to Elisha to get healed from his leprosy? And he goes, how much should I give you? He goes, oh, the healing's from God, it's for free. Well, Elisha's servant saw an opportunity and ran after him and says, oh, some folks came. Can you give me a few of these and a few of those? And he got struck with the leprosy that Naaman got healed from. Balaam the prophet, he chose money over protecting God's people. The prodigal son ran off to spend his father's inheritance. Ananias and Sapphira lied about their gift, claiming they were giving more than they did. Money easily interferes with the call to go. And so I think for us Americans, we need to be aware that there's a competing entity that could get in the way of the exciting adventure of faith that God has for you and me. Well, in Genesis 12:1, the Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your people, your father's house, and go to the land I will show you, and I will bless you. And Abraham left his country, but he took Lot with him. He took everything he had, his family with him. I think it's not a coincidence that God does not make His covenant with Abram until after Lot separated from him in the next chapter. And by the way, some people will start the journey with you, but they won't complete the journey. But that means you've been called, you need to go forth, because God has a plan specifically for your life. Okay? And God has a plan for Abram and Sarah. He knew his family would hold him back. According to the Jewish Midrash, okay, this is the Jewish commentary on scriptures, Abraham's father, Terah, was a commander in Nimrod's army, and he was also an idol worshiper. And so when God called Abram to follow him, the first thing he does is he goes into his father's sacred area, and he chops off the heads of all of the idols except for one, and he puts the sword in the idol's hand. So Abraham's father comes home and says, what happened to my idols? What did you do? He goes, I didn't do anything. The sword's in the idol's hand. He goes, don't be silly. An idol couldn't do. And Abraham tricked him to profess, these are just idols that have no power. It's his way of saying, you know what, Dad, quit playing spiritual games with idols. And Abraham, he was called away from the city of Ur, which, by the way, was dedicated to the moon god. It's a pagan city that worships the dark side. And sometimes God's going to call you and me away from negative spiritual influences so that we can enjoy His abundant life. Sometimes we've got some bad habits that get in the way of the anointing and the blessing and the calling and the fruit of our ministry. And, you have to wrestle that out and hand God over what He wants from you so you can experience all that He'd like to give to you. You see, God has a plan for Abram to go to a land that I will show you. And God is taking him there. God is involved. He calls us to a different life, a life of faith. And you have an opportunity. You can do what you've always done and get what you always got, or you can go with life with God connected to you. And by the way, isn't that why you gave your life to Jesus in the first place? So that you can experience the living God and let Him show up in your life in the most incredible ways? I think too many Christians, what happens to us is we get fatigued on the journey. We get disillusioned. We settle and we never make it to what God promised. We take our eyes off of the promise and we settle for less than what God wanted. And friends, I want you to understand something. What you're actually missing out on is the presence of God Himself. More of God is His plan, more of His miraculous involvement and intervention and provisions and eternal significance. This is the elements of our spiritual journey that He has in mind for you and for me. And it could have happened to Abraham. He got distracted because he starts off on the journey and a famine hits. So now he has to go down to Egypt, where he has a problem. You see, his wife is beautiful. And so he's afraid that if he goes to Egypt, the Pharaoh's going to go, wow, that guy's wife is beautiful. Kill him so I can have his wife. So wife, just tell everybody I'm your brother, okay? And so Abraham's faith fails. And Pharaoh actually does take Sarah, his wife. And imagine the frustration that Abraham would have as somebody else takes his wife to be their own. And fortunately, God steps in and tells the Pharaoh, oh, no. Okay? You give that man back his girl or else it's going to be bad for you. And here's some radical lessons that you and I can learn. That first of all, even the greatest man of faith fails. And the promise and blessing of God still came to pass even though he faltered. God's not as concerned about our failures. It's about us going, oh, Lord, I failed. And involving Him in His restoration, embracing His grace, getting back up to complete the calling that He laid before you. Okay? Failure is a lesson. It's not a destination. And Abraham, he experiences an important truth. Wherever I am, no matter what, God is with me. And I want you to hear this because this is the same thing Jesus says to you and me. I am with you always. So I don't know what you've got going on in your life right now, what you're struggling with, what you're afraid of, what you're disillusioned by, what you're still hoping for. But I want you to know Jesus is with you. And He's ready to be activated. He's going to respond to your prayer life. And He might be waiting on you to go so that He can come alive in your life. This is an important piece. In Genesis 15, God informed Abram, do not fear. I am your shield and exceedingly great reward. And I just need you to hear this. He is our shield, an exceedingly great reward. When God makes that statement, He's got all the stuff that was taken from Sodom and Gomorrah. And He just says, yeah, you can take your stuff. I don't need any gifts. I'm connected to God. And God says, that's right. I'm your shield and your exceedingly great reward. Okay. And too often we get, starstruck by this, that, and the other, when the truth of the matter is the most important thing you have is your relationship with God. Well, the next verse gives us insight into God's plan. I will make you into a great nation. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. And all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. All the families on the earth will be blessed through you. Now, first of all, God said, I will make your name great. Realize in the chapter before this one, the Tower of Babel happens when the people said, let us build ourselves a city and a tower that reaches to heaven so we can make a name for ourselves. They want to make a name for themselves, and what happens? God destroys the tower, confuses their language, everybody disperses. No name for themselves. But in the next chapter, when God's involved and he says, I'm going to make a name for you, here we are 4,000 years later. And Abraham is, for the Jews, the Christians, in Islam, the primary person. 4,000 years later, his name, I'm preaching about him today. Okay, you see the difference when God's involved. But let's get to the most powerful thing I'm going to say all morning. It's through Abraham that God would make the Jewish people, from which would come the Messiah, from whom humanity would receive salvation. Jesus comes from the lineage, the seed of Abraham. And so God is inviting him into a cosmic, eternal plan and vision. And he says, go. You go, I'm going with you, and I've got big plans for your life. And he went at 75 years old. And this is bad news for some of you because that means there's no retirement when you belong to the Lord. I know you were hoping to golf and boat and relax. But you know what? The Lord still wants to move to you and through you. While you golf, while you boat, while you socialize, you are still an avenue of His grace and love and power and hope to whoever crosses your path. Abram traveled 400 miles until he got to the great tree of Morah at Shechem. It's a well-known landmark. You know, it's funny. People will say to me, okay, make a left on 118th Street, and then when you see the big tree, make a right. And you get there, and there's a whole bunch of big trees. You're like, okay, come on. All right? I need a little more precision here. By the way, there's actually the gate in Cana that he passed through, and here it is. All right? That gate is 4,000 years old. I've been there. They don't let you walk through it, though, anymore, okay? But, yeah, a piece of history right here. And when Abraham arrives, he makes an altar to the Lord, and the Lord appears to him. This is the first time we have an actual appearance of the Lord to anybody that we know of. We know he walked with Adam and Enoch and Noah. It's possible that he showed up in visible form, but the scriptures don't say so. But here with Abraham, we have an actual manifestation. And a lot of people think, scholars believe this is the pre-incarnate Jesus, because Jesus says in John 8:56, Abraham saw my day and was glad. Here it is. And I want to point out that whenever Abraham encounters God, he worships by building an altar. And that's basically saying, I belong to you, I'm surrendered to you, I'm doing life with you. And I don't know what your altar might be. It might be your kitchen table where you get up every morning and open your scriptures and have a cup of coffee with the Lord. It might be on your lunch break when you sit in the car and you know, have a conversation with the Lord and have your prayer time there. It might be at your bedside where, you know, you have your evening devotions. I don't know, but that's a sacred place where you can encounter the living God. And I want to say something. That place, for me, is the most precious location on earth. Once you have a spot where you meet with God regularly, guess what? He reveals himself to you. Yeah, it takes a little extra effort, but the extra leads to the extraordinary experience of God. And perhaps romance is the best way to describe the dynamic that I'm referring to. You know, God created romance. You know, sadly, humanity ruined it, but, you know, think of a young couple in love, okay? Oh my goodness. They spend hours on the phone. I don't know what you could talk about for hours, but they can spend hours on the phone. And, they can't get enough information about each other. When they're separated, they live for the moment when they're going to be reunited. And in the in-between time, they send letters and texts and emails and phone calls. And, it's in love. And friends, this is how God feels about you and how he hopes you'll yearn for him. In Isaiah 41:8, it says this: Abraham was a friend of God. And it can literally be translated as Abraham who loves me. This is what it means to be a friend of God. Somebody who loves him. Okay? And you and I, we're invited to this sacred romance, a yearning. And that yearning can carry you through the desert times to that land that he will show us. We all have those awkward moments, but guess what? God shows up because he loves you. And when you love him, oh yeah, the supernatural activity is underway. Sadly, I think a lot of believers stop short of falling in love and entering into that relationship. They know all about God. They read all of the theology. They understand the ins and outs of the Christian doctrine. But that's not the same as creating that spot and having coffee with God and being vulnerable with him and pausing and letting him speak to you and interrupt your life, redirect your life, fill your life, touch your heart, speak to your mind. Yeah, that's the invitation. Many, I think, are like the church of Ephesus in Revelation 2. You do significant ministry, but I have this against you. You left your first love. And I want to take you back to your first love right here, right now. Remember when somebody told you about how God feels towards you? Remember when you learned about what God's done because he's so passionate about you? Remember when you had that experience that made you and God, you commit your life to him? Go back to that moment, because that's what he's after. Well, God calls us all to an assignment, and he'll personally show you what it is because he's going to go with you. He never asks you to do something and say, hey, go take care of that for me. He always accompanies you through his Spirit. And I don't want you to settle on anything less than the supernatural life of God flowing to you and through you. This is huge. The Abrahamic covenant, it's something that you and I participate in. The same calling that was extended to Abraham, the father of faith. First, to believe what God says about him and us. He just believed and he was made righteous. Number two, embrace the truth that God provides for himself, the Lamb, Jesus Christ. And go. Be a blessing to everyone on earth by sharing Jesus Christ with all who cross your path. Paul makes a correlation between Abraham's covenant and New Testament Christianity 5 different times. Okay? In other words, you and I, we're invited to be part of a 4,000-year covenant. Well, I close. At age 12, Robert Louis Stevenson was looking out from his window into the dark, and he was watching a man light the street lamps. And his governess came in and says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm watching a man cut holes in the darkness. I tell you this because, let's be honest, our society is rapidly changing. And we can complain that the world isn't the way it used to be. Every time I talk to my mom, I got to hear a lecture about how things used to be. Okay. I say, well, Mom, it used to be that the Nazis were, coming across the world when you were around. I don't know. It's always been bad. Okay. But here's the deal. Right now, the world seems to be in an awkward place, and you and I, we can hide from it, we can complain about it and gripe, or we could cut holes in the spiritual darkness. Because God calls us to go into this world of ours, and don't be offended by sinners' sin, be provoked to do something about it. Don't curse the darkness, but shine the light of Jesus. The world desperately needs to know that there's a God who loves them and is for them and wants to move in their lives. And by the way, we have the Bible and the Spirit of God to guide us and the catalyst to push us forward. I think the church needs to be disturbed into action. So I close with the prayer of St. Francis Drake, an English sea captain. He was the first person to circle the globe in 1577. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, when we arrive safely because we have sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when the abundance of things we possess caused us to lose our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we've ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas where storms will show your mastery. Amen.